Okay, we'll do part 3 here, folks. Micah talked about the project he's working on, which I was fascinated to learn about with Forward View, and this notion of quote-unquote loose contracts, which I like that approach. And, this is something that's really fascinating here for me, and it really does tell the tale, I think, that so much of this depends upon storytelling and the effectiveness of the kind of storytelling that we're doing, that is the marketing, but capturing those stories and telling them in effective ways, and we need to be doing that better, and we can now with the different technologies we have in the internet. That's a great piece. And Sharon also noted that we have to reward farmers, which is a critical piece of all of this. If there are no rewards in it, then it's going to be challenging for farmers to make some of these moves. Some of these moves really do involve investments, and so there needs to be a payback on the investments as well as on the goodwill. So Teresa noted, something that I thought was really interesting in her post. It really is sort of what happened with the land grant institutions and this whole notion of agricultural improvement. These are things that came about in the late 1800s in the United States. That's when we had the creation of the land grant institutions. And things did need to change. There did need to be improvement. We've taken that thing pretty far toward a logical or an illogical conclusion sometimes, but there's this question of, how much do we improve, and when have we taken things so far, that we're actually at the point we've created genetic erosion and funneling issues for ourselves. We've created different nutrient management issues and all kinds of things. So that was a great thread. Val really brings out these issues of confinement, genetic purity, and disease. And, I wanted to talk about the confinement piece a little bit because, as you may or may not know, with regard to confinement, particularly for poultry, one of the arguments for that is because of the disease vectors of wild birds and other organisms that bring the diseases forward. So, there is some concern about, and there's a push in many places actually to make sure that poultry are totally contained and that wild birds cannot interact with them, introduce disease. That disease can also transmutate and impact humans. So this is where things start to get to be a bit of a challenge in the conversations. And let's see, and then also with that confinement issue, let's bear in mind that there's this nutrient management piece, which when they go into total confinement, there's pretty much total control of what can actually happen with the manure management. And so that's another argument that's made for concentration and confinement in many cases. Oni, thank you. You brought out the national master statistic here, looking at the arable land comparison, which was a really interesting way to tackle this. And I do think, obviously, the question that we have here about can Britain feed itself, can the United States feed itself, what's the comparison? It is indeed land-based in some ways, and it's also important to be thinking about the fact that it's not just arable land, but it's different types of arable land for different types of products. But then we've also got this whole notion of culture and education, and if there's not appropriate if there aren't appropriate cultural practices and there's not good education behind the farm practices people are picking up, it doesn't matter what there is or isn't there in terms of arable land in many ways. And it really makes me think about something that I'll share with you here. When we go back to the armor map, maybe thinking about it in this way that Oni puts forward and others, should we really be thinking about what is best in terms of regions of the United States for particular crops? I think for a lot of us, there's one side that wants to shoot that down because we understand there's such an importance to having diversified family farms in a particular area. But then again, we also have to recognize that we need to cast these farms really in the light of what makes the most sense from an ecological perspective. So, a bit of a challenge there as we try to think through things. And Lisa really gave us a fine and succinct critique as she was looking at by producing in condensed environments, we build up waste, air pollution, disease, And again, just to capitalize on the point just a few seconds ago, I do agree that that's true. It is interesting when you think about the confinement piece, and I'm not arguing for it, but when it's there, capturing those nutrients and turning those things into biogas. There was a big announcement here in Vermont last week in which Middlebury College is teaming with, I believe it's a 800 or 1,000 cow farm to utilize their biogas for the production of their electricity, which essentially is part of what Green Mountain College has done, and kind of an interesting scenario there that we can talk about more if you like. Methane digesters, I think, are absolutely critical. We should have much more in the way of those here in the United States. Germany, last time I looked, they exceeded what we have in the United States by more than tenfold. So very interesting there. And finally, the last post that I was looking at was Sharon's, and you know, that thread in and of itself, I think, sums up what so many of us are trying to figure out. You know, is when is livestock agriculture appropriate? You know, when is it not? We're thinking about, you know, plant-based diets, and we're thinking about what's particularly important in those regards, in how we actually produce many of those products, and we're trying to find a balance. And I think the reason that I like using Fairley so much is because he suggests that, you know, we need to allow the nuance in these discussions. You know, the nuance really does matter, because it's not, from my view anyway, you know, it's not one side or the other. You know, it is really recognizing that we have a mosaic, if you will, an ecological fabric, a mosaic of different ecosystems across the United States and elsewhere. And we need to understand that there are different ways to think about those ecosystems in terms of what we're doing from an agricultural perspective, what makes sense with livestock in certain cases, what doesn't. You know, when can the default livestock concept be utilized, and utilized very effectively? You know, and you also have to wonder a little bit when times are tough, when they're really lean, you know, perhaps this notion of default livestock kicks in even more. And you know, I have to wonder if that's not something that's going to come back here in the coming years. And you know, just being in India, watching people utilize the forage that was there on the roadsides and other places that seemed relatively inaccessible, certainly places that you know, wouldn't be considered tillable. You know, that was something that was you know, really rather eye-opening. It was default livestock at work, you know, on really a massive scale in India. So thanks for your patience. Hope these comments and reflections were helpful, and I hope you have a great day. Take care. Bye-bye.